At Ease Gamers, this is Game Sergeant Scurry, and today we're going to be reviewing another Wii U controller. Today it's going to be the Wii U Afterglow Pro Controller. So, as you can see, the basic layout is pretty much the same as the standard Wii U Pro Controller, and actually the size this time is also pretty much the same. It actually is a little bit tighter. You know, long wise it's a little shorter, but it's actually a little bit bulkier in the back, on the back side. Now I will say this one does feel, I don't know, it doesn't feel that. Here's the thing with the Wii U controllers, even though they sometimes they look weird, weird, and that they look like they're not that comfortable, they are actually, pretty solid and their form factor, and they do feel okay. This one doesn't. I will say it doesn't feel as nearly as good as the either the Power A or the standard Wii U Pro controller, but it feels okay. Like I can still see myself using this after long periods of time and not feeling any strain. In fact, see the back of the grips are a little bit bulkier. And with the smaller, the slimmer grips on the back of these controllers, like after, for example, long periods of time when you're playing Smash, sometimes the smaller the grips are, I don't know, sometimes I get like a cripple on my finger because I'm, holding the controller too tight or something. But with these, it's bulky enough to where if I grip it too hard, I won't necessarily cripple my fingers or anything, but they'll just, it's very firm. Now it does feel like, actually this, even though like you can see the insides of the controller and stuff, and it looks like it's made of cheap plastic, but the plastic, like this is a real heavy controller. In comparison to the regular Pro controller, it's actually, I don't think it's as heavy as the regular Pro controller. It's a little bit lighter, but I think this controller is heavier than this controller, but it does feel pretty, like it's not super light like a classic controller or something, but it doesn't feel very like cheap plastic. It looks like cheap plastic, and that's why most people wouldn't buy it. But anyway, let's get into the controls themselves. So as you can see, like I said, the basic layout of the buttons are practically the same. The only two obvious things are that the power button is way down here, which I'll get into that later, and there's a random button right here. This is the home button. Now the home button is actually really hard to get to. With both of the standard Pro controller and the Power A controller, in my opinion, the Power A controller had the easiest to get to home button and power button. Actually, the power button, I failed to say that in the last video. The power button is a little difficult to get to because of this analog stick in the way. But, and I guess it's the same thing for the home button, but it's still relatively much easier to get to than any of the other controllers. Now with this one, this button's easy to get to, and I know exactly why they made it that easy to get to. And the start button's easy to get to, the minus is easy to get to, but not the home button. I have to really stretch my thumb out to get to that. And I have relatively average sized hands, so it's not because I have small hands or anything. Now let's look at the back of the controllers here. So, this is what they look like from the side. They're really, jutted out. Now, this is the main problem I have with this controller. The creators of this controller were probably trying to give the people who wanted to use it the idea that these buttons were analog. See, they look and feel analog, right? But see, most if not all the Wii U games were made to use just digital click buttons and not analog buttons. So it doesn't matter how lightly you push the button. If you just barely tap it, the game thinks you push the button. Whereas in other games, like, you have to push it quite a ways for it to think, and it's really easy to press. Like, you barely have to touch it at all, and it'll still think you pushed it. Same with both buttons. That can get annoying in certain games, like for me in Smash Brothers. I don't. Sometimes I'll accidentally grab when I didn't need to, or in Mario Kart, I'll accidentally do a drift hop when I didn't need to. Or in the case of, I have Call of Duty Black Ops 2 for the Wii U, and I'll accidentally shoot even though I barely hit the trigger, and I didn't want to shoot, or gave away my position or something. So yeah, that is a big problem with this controller. So now the other interesting thing about this controller, only main draw to get this controller, is something I'll have to show by turning the Wii U on. So let me do that. So yeah, interestingly enough, even though the power button is way down here, because it's in like the line of, like, you can get to it with both your thumbs pretty easily, because it's in the line of the button layout. So okay, so that red light, I do like that this controller has really bright lights, with it being called the Afterglow. So that means this controller is about dead, which I just got done charging it just a little bit so I can show you guys. Oh, that's another thing. This controller has pretty good battery life. It's not as good as the regular Wii U Pro controller, but it does last a while. I'd say about 60 to 75% less than, or percent of the Wii U controller. So yeah. Now, obviously, since this is called the Afterglow controller, you can expect that this button will make the controller glow really brightly. In fact, it's probably too bright for your eyes right now. I don't know. But, so yeah, I mean, it's pretty cool. Now, with the Xbox 360 controller, I used to have an Xbox 360 controller that was also an Afterglow controller. And with that controller, now this does have you can actually see the vibrating, I forget, vibrator weights, I guess is what you call those. And when the Xbox 360 controller would vibrate, the Afterglow had a setting to where it would light up with the vibrations. Now this one does not have that setting, and I'm a little disappointed about that. And it's probably because it's not connected. Like with the Xbox 360 controller, it was a wired controller that hooked to the Xbox 360. You couldn't detach that wire. With this one, it's not wired, so that's probably why I can understand that. And it's it's a charged controller that would take a lot of battery. And especially, even with the lights on, you can probably tell that's a lot of lighting for, like with that amount of lighting, you can bet your ass that, it'll take up a lot of battery life. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the Wii U back off, and let's talk about just the buttons. So, okay, it's off. So now, even though the triggers are pretty, obnoxious when you're in the game, that's pretty much the only one of the two downsides of this controller. The bumper buttons are actually pretty easy to get to. You can actually kind of just hit them with the just the crease, the hinge of your index finger pretty easily. Like, it's pretty easy to get to them. If you want to hook it, I mean, it's actually pretty easy too. I will say these are also like, this one's not as bad as the triggers, but like if you barely tap these, these will also hit the button. Like I can remember also playing Smash and I'd shield by accident just because I accidentally pushed it a little too hard on the triggers. But they are click triggers, not as clicky as the analog or the Power A controller, but like the standard Wii U Pro controller. Now, the analog sticks do feel really big in comparison to most analog sticks. I would even compare them to the Xbox 360 controller, mainly because this layout of the controller, or this design, is pretty much the exact same as the Afterglow Xbox 360 controller. The only difference is that the button layout is swapped. So the controller, or the analog sticks do feel really big. And actually, these analog sticks, from what I remember of the Xbox 360 versions, are really like flimsy. I mean, they feel tight, and that would be good with games that don't require a lot of flicking with the sticks. But if I'm playing Smash Brothers, which I would suggest not playing just because of the trigger buttons, yeah, that is a problem, because I can remember with my Xbox 360 controller, like just barely, just a little bit of too much force on the sticks, and the stick kind of broke in half. It's not a very sturdy stick, so I wouldn't recommend playing games that require a lot of, or that you'd be clenching the controller really tightly, because the sticks will break. I guarantee you. Like this side of this, like you can probably see here, like I'm pushing the rubber down and up because something chipped off on the side of this, and it's actually right up in here. Like the chip is right here. I can actually feel the bulk of it, or the bump up here. Yeah. So it's not a very sturdy. At least the sticks are not very sturdy. Like I said, the controller itself is. Now the buttons. Let's talk about those. So, the analog stick actually doesn't. I mean, it's not as responsive as. In fact, I would even compare it with the Xbox 360's D-pad. Did I say analog stick? I think I did. Well, anyway, with the Xbox 360's D-pad as a really unresponsive, kind of difficult to navigate. Well, not navigate, just it doesn't it just feels like the Xbox 360's D-pad. It almost feels like it would be an analog stick or something, with how much it kind of spins around and not as directional, I guess is what you'd say for it. But yeah, not the best D-pad. In fact, I would even classify it with one of the worst D-pads. And that's just the because I guess they wanted to keep the same basic design as the Xbox 360's Afterglow controller, which that also had a pretty crappy D-pad. Now let's talk about the buttons. Now the buttons, these feel pretty much, actually these feel a little bit higher, raised than the standard Pro controller. And actually, as you can see, they're actually raised quite a bit, because right here you can obviously see there's a little platform that the buttons sit on. And I guess that's because my thumb is kind of it's not going straight like this. It's kind of raised up like that. So I can see why they put the buttons on a platform like that, and I actually like that. It makes the buttons a lot easier to get to. Now the biggest problem with this controller, other than the triggers, is the plus and minus button. They are pretty, if you're holding the controller in a in a standard way you'd be playing game, like a Mario game or something, that button is really hard to get to. You have to really reach your hand up there to get to that plus button or that minus button. Same thing on both sides. It's not like standard Wii U Pro controller where you can just move your finger to the side and you get the plus button and the minus button. You have to reach up and get to the buttons really high. And yeah, that's a big problem. And like I said, the power button on here is really easy to get to. And the home button is probably the worst one. The home button was relatively difficult to get to. I mean, I could reach it without much force. But the button's in the middle of the controller. I'll give it that. You pass. I'll give you a pass, Wii U Pro controller, but not this one. This one I have to go out of my way to reach that button, and it is really far away. So, and finally, the plug-in for the USB is the same as the regular Wii U Pro Controller and not flipped upside down like the Power A one was. So yeah, that is the Afterglow Wii U Pro Controller. It does come in different colors of glow, like I think it comes in orange and green along with blue. So if you ever find one of these, try it out. At least if you're used to analog controls with the trigger buttons, it might feel more familiar to you if you're used to using an Xbox 360 or PlayStation controller. But just be warned that even though it feels analog, it's not actually analog, it's still digital, to where if you barely touch it, it'll still think you're pushing the button with full force. So that's the biggest downside to this controller. That and the flimsy sticks and the hard to reach plus and minus buttons, which is a pretty easy thing to overcome. So I guess I'd say just the biggest draw away from it is the sticks, and definitely the trigger buttons. So yeah, that was, like I said, that was the Afterglow Pro Controller. Thank you guys for watching. Oh, and it's just a cool design. Any controller that you can see the insides of is really cool. So yeah, thank you guys for watching. Take care and carry on.